Beneath the surface, there's more than meets the eye. The great African sea forest stretches from the shores of Cape Town more than 1,000 kilometers north into Namibia. Located in relatively shallow water, this underwater kelp forest holds enormous value, protecting the coastline from swells and storms. This is where Craig Foster spent his childhood, swimming in the rock pools near his home in Cape Town, learning how to adapt his body temperature to the frigid Atlantic waters, how to hold his breath for several minutes at a time so he could swim down without scuba gear to explore what lay beneath that magical kelp canopy. As an adult, his work as a documentary filmmaker would take him all around the world. But midlife, amidst a time of discouragement and depression, he was drawn to return to diving in his beloved sea forest. One day, an underwater encounter stopped him in his tracks. There was an octopus who had wrapped herself in algae like a cloak and was staring back at him warily out of one eye. He was fascinated by this mysterious creature who did not flee, but rather seemed curious about him. Foster was struck by a crazy idea. What if he went diving there every day for a year and never missed a day? What might he notice? His year is the subject of a film called My Octopus Teacher. It won an Oscar for Best Documentary a few years back. Here are just 3 pearls of wisdom from this film. First, beneath the surface, there's more than meets the eye. Second, we're all connected, and we're more alike than we think. Third, transformation takes time. Of his year-long endeavor, Foster says that people asked him, "Why are you going to the same place every day?" But he said that's when you start to notice the subtle differences. That's how you get to know the wild. It took going in day after day to really notice what the world of this octopus was like. He learned to spot octopus tracks on the seafloor, to identify which animals she ate, and which predators lay in wait for her. As he was noticing her, she too was noticing him. At first, she would just peek out from the safety of her cave. But one day, she inched out, her arms gathered behind her, then extended just one curious limb toward him. She reached for his hand and touched it gently. He was astonished. There were more encounters like this. As she began to trust him more, she would hover close, sometimes touching his hand or even resting on his chest. He sensed that her curiosity resonated with his own. The more he noticed, the more he learned about this resourceful creature. She could match her color and pattern to her surroundings in order to avoid predators. She could shift her shape as needed, from a sprawling web to a slim ray. She could move in all sorts of ways, crawling, swimming, even walking along on 2 legs. Once, as she tried to evade a shark, she headed for shallow water and jumped right out of the water onto the rocky shore. However, as clever and adaptive as she was, she could not evade her attackers forever. Several months into his daily dives, Foster spotted a shark trailing her. And though she hid under a rock, the shark dove in after her and emerged with a severed arm in its mouth. The wounded octopus struggled to make her way back to her den. The next day, he found her there, weak, pale, barely moving. He had the deep sense that her vulnerability mirrored his own. He said, "People think of an octopus like an alien, but the closer you get, you realize how alike you are." He returned each day wondering if he'd still find her alive. 12 days later, he caught a glimpse of a tiny, perfect miniature arm that had started to grow back. Over the next weeks, the arm grew and became more functional. Her confidence returned, and she began to venture out of the den again. After about 100 days, the arm had fully regrown. Transformation takes time. In today's passage from chapter 13 of Luke's Gospel, Jesus dives into a tangle of questions posed to him by a crowd. They ask him about some Galileans who had been killed by Pilate's men near the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus responds, "Do you think these people deserved to meet such a violent end? Or how about those who were killed accidentally when the Tower of Siloam collapsed?" To both questions, Jesus replies, "No, they did not deserve this." However, Jesus does want to remind us that we do not always know when or how we will meet our death. And it is because of this fragility, this uncertainty, that we must always seek to live our lives with integrity and turn our hearts to God. We can almost hear the anxiety in the voices of Jesus' listeners as they press him about the misfortune of those who died. Perhaps these events activated their own fear, their own vulnerability as they tried to make sense of it. Maybe they wondered, maybe those people were sinners. Maybe they weren't worthy of God's favor. So often, this is what drives us to regard people as other, as undesirable or unlovable. We try to keep their suffering at arm's length, to deny the possibility that we too might one day share their fate. Why do people suffer? It's a hard question. As he often does, Jesus fields this hard question indirectly. He tells a story about a tree and a gardener. Let's look at this story with some of the insights from Craig Foster's work. The parable sets up a problem. There's a figless fig tree. The landowner orders the gardener to cut it down. It seems practical enough. If the tree isn't producing any valuable fruit, it's just taking up space. But the gardener protests, perhaps seeing beyond the superficial appearance of the barren tree to a deeper value. What might that value be? One ancient Roman text suggests that it was a common practice to plant fig trees in vineyards to provide a structure for trellising the grapevines, and that higher quality wines were made from the grapes at the top of the fig trees. Perhaps this is what the gardener saw, that barren fig tree was actually essential in producing the choice grapes and hence the best wines. Surely this would be a compelling reason to keep it around. So the gardener says, what would happen if we gave it a year, if we went every day without missing a day, tending to it, fertilizing it? What signs of new growth might we notice? It's a strange little story. But what sort of wisdom might we glean from it? And how does it fit into the larger story of Jesus' life and ministry as it's told by Luke? First, beneath the surface, there's more than meets the eye. In chapter 13 of Luke's Gospel, Jesus has already set his face toward Jerusalem. As he travels from town to town, healing and teaching, Jesus looks closely, and he notices those who, on the surface, would seem to be lowly by society's standards: women, children, the sick, and the suffering. And he responds to their wildest hope, reaching out to them, raising them up, and reversing their fortunes. Next, Luke calls us to notice that the life of discipleship is a life of connection. When Jesus sends his disciples ahead of him, he instructs them to travel lightly and to rely on the kindness of strangers. And Jesus never missed a chance to point out that beneath categories like ethnicity or class or gender, we're more alike than we think. For example, in Luke chapter 10, when asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus tells a story about a man who was a victim of a violent crime and left to die on the side of the road. Two passers-by notice him, but fail to help him. It's only the Good Samaritan who renders aid, someone from a different, despised ethnic group. Finally, Luke would have us notice that transformation takes time. Over and over in the 3 years of his public ministry, Jesus shows that even people who have been suffering for a very long time can experience healing. For example, just after this passage in chapter 13 of Luke, Jesus heals a woman who has been unable to stand up for more than 18 years. More than 18 years. So perhaps the story of the barren fig tree begins to open up a little in the light of Jesus' teachings. Beneath the surface, there's more than meets the eye. We're all connected and we're more alike than we think. Transformation takes time. But what about that very last line of the parable? Is the gardener really going to let the landowner take an axe to this tree after a year if it doesn't start producing fruit? I think of Craig Foster speaking of his octopus teacher. He says, "She'd made me realize just how precious wild places are. You're in touch with this wild place and it's speaking to you. Its language is visible. Slowly, you start to care about all the animals, even the tiniest. You realize that every one is important. You sense how vulnerable their lives are and how vulnerable all our lives are on this planet." And I think of Jesus speaking in chapter 12 of Luke's Gospel. He says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. And consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Consider the lilies, they neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. If God so clothes the grass of the field, how much more will God clothe you? Yes, Jesus tells us, if God notices and cares for all of these, how much more does God notice us and care for us? As we continue on our journey through Lent, I wonder what might happen if we decided to show up every day for the next few weeks. Just set aside a few minutes to become quiet and to sink beneath the surface of our busy lives. I wonder what we might notice. We might just find ourselves in the presence of God, dwelling just beneath the surface with a knowing gaze and loving arms, just waiting for us to notice God, noticing us.